Do you ever feel like your photography has been in a bit of a plateau and you haven't been improving? Or maybe you're fairly new and you're not entirely sure what to focus on in order to improve your portraiture. In either case, don't worry, this video is going to help you out. In this video, I'm going to talk about techniques to take stellar portraits condensed into key points in 3 main categories. And lastly, what I think is the most important aspect when it comes to capturing a photograph that truly stands out. And the best part is, anyone can benefit from these tips regardless what camera or lens you use. For this video, I've decided to use exclusively natural light so that these tips aren't limited by your access to lighting equipment. But before we start, this video is assuming that you already know how to use your camera and properly expose an image. And if you're still fairly new and you don't really understand aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, pause here and check out this video where I explain all of that really quick, and then come back and check this out. Lastly, I just want to say that none of the tips that I cover in this video are hard and fast rules of photography. It's more so just guidelines to help you get started when you're trying to create an image that's generally appealing. Because when it comes to photography, it's like any other form of art. There is no right or wrong. Ultimately, you are the only one who decides whether your photograph is good or whether it's bad. Unless you're shooting photos for a client, in which case it becomes a lot more objective. But anyways, let's get started. As far as what lens you're going to be using, that's entirely up to you. 50mm is a great place to start because it's a really versatile lens and it most closely resembles how we naturally see things with the human eye. But if you want that bokeh, which is a photography term for depth of field, which basically just means the background is really blurry and soft, using a longer focal length like an 85, a 100, or even a 200 are going to be better for that. However, when I'm shooting portraits, my absolute favorite is a 35mm. I feel that getting closer to a subject with a wider lens makes the portrait feel more intimate, and 35mm is a super versatile focal length as you can get wide angles or close-ups with it. But just make sure to be intentional with your angles and how close you get with wider lenses, because you can easily distort features of the body and it can look really weird really quick. Now that we've got our lens picked out, it's time to talk about composition. The first thing we're going to talk about is how to compose our image. And this is something that comes naturally the more that you shoot, but to get started, there are a few things that we can keep in mind in order to get us moving in the right direction. The first thing we're going to want to do is position our subject in the center of the frame. If we do want our subject more off to the side of the frame, then it's a good rule of thumb to have them facing towards the center. Make sure not to have too much headroom above them, and the rule of thirds is a good starting point to help us compose our shot while we're developing our eye. Picturing a 3x3 grid over the image, we can align our subject or a focal point such as their eyes along one of those lines to help us balance the image. If we've got a horizon in the background, making sure it's horizontal will make the image feel more natural. Just be sure that you don't have the horizon or other background elements in line with your subject's eyes, or it could distract from them. Next, I like to try and incorporate parts of the environment to make the portrait a little more interesting. So we've got our subject placed in this bush here for that purpose. Using things like bushes, water, environmental objects, and objects in the foreground will help us make our 2D image feel like it has more depth and make it a little more intriguing. When we see a face, the first thing we're naturally drawn to are the eyes, so it's important to get them in focus. If our subject's face is at an angle, we typically want to focus on the eye nearest to the camera. Keep in mind that the more you open your aperture, the better your depth of field will be, but the more difficult it will be to get the eyes in focus. Now, onto the light. A photograph is a 2-dimensional image, but with the right light, it can feel 3-dimensional. We want to add depth to our image, and one way that we can do that is by creating gradients of light on our subject. When we shot these demo photos, we got lucky and had this really nice overcast soft light, which meant we could pretty much shoot in any direction. But just because we're using soft, natural light doesn't mean we can't shape it. You can see that even though the light is very soft, it still looks different on our subject's face depending on which way she's facing. Going back to adding depth to our image, we want to use this to our advantage. I like to try and position the face so that the light is hitting it from above or above and slightly to one side. And from there, shooting from from the shadow side of the face, we can capture a gradient from the light fall off and help us create that depth and dimension that we're looking for. But if we're shooting with hard light, it's an entirely different story. However, it's autumn here and it's overcast virtually every single day, all day, so this is the weather we had for the video. Anyways, on the subject of shaping the light, we first do that with how the portrait is lit, but that's not the only opportunity we have to do so. Now, everybody has a different taste when it comes to editing, and depending on what you're shooting, you might be editing in one way or another way, so I'm not really going to dive into the stylistic aspect of it here. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk about a couple things that you can do with your portrait regardless what your editing style is that'll help it stand out a little bit more. However, if you like my editing style and you're curious how I do it, just let me know in the comments, and if people are interested, I'll just make a full in-depth video showing how I personally do it. Essentially, my editing process is to create the overall look in Lightroom, and then I export the images to Photoshop for the retouching. Here I've got the overall look of this image where I like it, but there's a little more we can do here to make it pop. The first thing we're going to do is shape the light. The eye is naturally drawn to the brightest part of an image, so we want to bring the background down a bit so it's not distracting from our subject. There are a few ways we can do this in Lightroom, the easiest being to select the mask tool, create a background mask, and then Lightroom selects the background and we can adjust it from there. We can also select a subject mask and then adjust our subject's overall brightness as well. This method is fine, but personally I prefer a different approach that I think feels more natural, as doing it like this can sometimes just feel like it's a cutout on a background. What I like to do is use the radial gradient tool to darken the outside of our image and pull focus to our subject gradually. To do this, create a new radial gradient mask and size it so that it's around your subject or subject's face, applying a good bit of feather so that our gradient is nice and smooth. If you want to see where your gradient is applying, you can hit the O key. Then we can invert the mask, and from there just bring down the exposure until we have a nice gradual shift from dark to light. Another thing I like to do with this radial gradient is to drop the clarity a bit so that the edges of our frame are softer, again helping us draw focus to the subject. And if we turn this off and on, you can see how it draws attention to the subject. If you aren't happy with the composition of your photo, you can use the cropping tool to adjust. And now we're going to bring this into Photoshop for the retouching. In Photoshop, the first thing I like to do is the skin retouching. There are many ways to do this, but my favorite is frequency separation. This video is probably already running long, so I'm not going to dive into frequency separation, but if you just look up frequency separation Photoshop on YouTube, you're going to find loads of tutorials. This video is more about really simple tips and very broad strokes. However, if people are interested in an in-depth editing video that I mentioned before, I would definitely include frequency separation in that video. Anyways, the key with skin retouching is that unless you're doing beauty shots, you really don't want to push it too far, or you can easily get that really overdone plastic looking skin. So we use our frequency separation on areas of the skin that are a little more rough or where the light is a little bit uneven to smooth it out a little bit. After we get the skin smoothed out, I like to use the healing brush to remove blemishes. You just choose an area on the skin to sample from and paint over the spot you'd like to remove. There are other tools you can use like the clone stamp, but I find I have the best results with this. In addition to this, Photoshop has a relatively new remove tool which allows for extremely fast and easy removal of objects in the background, hairs on the face, and so on. I find it doesn't do as clean of a job on skin blemishes, but for everything else it seems to handle it really well. Now that the skin is taken care of, we once again shape our light. Dodging and burning is brightening parts of the image while darkening others. If your subject is quite fully lit, these areas of the face are where I typically apply dodging, and these areas are where I typically apply burning. Set the dodge tool to highlights at a strength of 5%, then look where the light and shadows naturally sit in our shot and use the dodge tool to add contrast and brighten areas you'd like to emphasize. Now, switching to the burn tool, set it to shadows with a strength of 5% and paint over the shadow areas like the cheeks to contour the face more. If the cheeks aren't already very dark, you might want to switch to mid-tones in order to darken them a little bit easier. Here you can see the difference it makes if I toggle the layer on and off. Another thing I like to do is dodge and burn the eyes. We use the same method to brighten the iris and catch light in the eye and darken the pupil, eyelid shadow, and limbal ring around the iris. An important thing with eyes is to make sure you're emphasizing how the light is naturally interacting with the eye and not just doing a blanket dodge across the whole iris, which can create an uncanny look unless you're intentionally going for that. After the dodging and burning is done, I like to use the sharpen tool set to 50% on the iris, eyelashes, and eyebrows. And voila, that's editing tips as fast as I could make it. Here is our image out of camera, colored, radial gradient applied, and finally retouched in Photoshop. And that concludes the 3 main things I think you should focus on if you want to improve your portraits. Another really important aspect is posing, but that seems to be something people struggle with, so I'm actually making an entire video just on that. So be sure that you subscribe so that you see that when it comes out in 2 weeks. But before I end this video, I did mention at the beginning that there was one aspect that I think is integral if you want to take photos that really stand out. And this doesn't just apply to portraiture, this applies to any kind of photography that you do. I actually think this is so important and such an overlooked aspect when people are starting out that I made a full YouTube video on it that you can check out here. But if you don't have the time or you don't want to watch it, I'll explain it really quick right now. The golden tip for taking standout shots that really catch the eye is angles. It sounds super simple, and it is, but shooting your subject from angles that the human eye wouldn't normally view that subject from can truly take your photos from basic to beautiful. Shoot from a high angle. Shoot from a low angle. Put objects in the foreground. Get above the subject. Turn them upside down. It's these creative angles that you take your shot from that are really going to make them stand out among the crowd. Because ultimately, anybody can have a camera and anybody can take a picture of anything. But what makes you stand out is your perspective and how you see these things. You can take 12 different photographers all shooting the same model or car or fill in the blank, and you're gonna get 12 different photos. Not everybody's gonna be able to think of putting the camera where you think to put it. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you got something useful out of it. I know it was really broad strokes, like I said, not really diving into anything substantial here, but I feel like these little things when you're starting out or when you're new can often be overlooked and you don't really think about it. And then if somebody tells you, like the angles thing, I didn't even think of that for the first couple years I was shooting, and then one day a photographer said you should take your photos from different angles, and I started doing that and my brain just exploded. My photos were so much better and I couldn't believe that I hadn't thought of that on my own. But anyways, that's what this video is about. I'm hoping to find little points that maybe you hadn't thought about on your own. But I'm rambling now, so I'm gonna go. Have a great week, everybody, and there's a new video next Monday. Okay, bye.